I left my husband to care for my ex, who was terminally ill. 3 years later, he passed away. I went back to my husband's house, but he refused to take me in because I had become pregnant by my ex. The day I sat before a judge with my son on my lap, while everyone stared at me as though I were a fraud, I heard for the first time, spoken aloud, that the man I had cared for until his death could not even have been my child's father. I felt as if the ground vanished beneath me as Javier's family lawyer spoke about sterility, timelines, and deception, treating me like a medical file rather than a woman who had given up everything for love. To understand how I ended up reduced to that version of myself, you have to go back to a time when I still believed the world owed me something for all that I was giving up. When I left the house I shared with Rodrigo, I felt more relief than fear. Behind me were his heavy silences, his mother's judgmental looks whenever I mentioned Javier, and the constant sense that I needed permission to feel anything at all. Rodrigo was correct, orderly, dependable, but he never understood that emotions do not simply shut down overnight just because someone gets married. Javier had been my first real love, the one who taught me how to live on my own, pay bills, and imagine a future with children. When he called me that night, his voice shaking as he told me he had advanced cancer, something inside me ignited. I knew that if I didn't go to him, the thought of letting him die alone would follow me forever. I remember Rodrigo's expression when I told him. He said he was sorry and suggested we help Javier from a distance, pay for medicine, send money if needed. He spoke about boundaries, respect for our marriage, and protecting our relationship. All I could see was selfishness, dressed up as responsibility. I told him I couldn't stand by, knowing Javier needed me, that this wasn't about romance, but basic humanity. He replied that I was his wife, not the caregiver of an ex who was crossing a line. The argument dragged on, filled with his accusations and my tears, until it became clear he would never understand my position. So I did what I believed was necessary. I packed my clothes into the large suitcase we had once used for our honeymoon and left the keys on the dining table. Rodrigo watched from the hallway with that familiar mix of anger and childish disappointment that always irritated me. He asked if I was certain, if I was truly leaving our home for a sick man with whom I supposedly had no future. I told him he didn't understand and that one day he would realize I was doing the right thing. I closed the door without turning back. As I walked down the stairs, I kept telling myself that time would put everything in order and that someday he would appreciate having been married to someone capable of such sacrifice. With Javier, life narrowed to the hospital and his apartment. Mornings were filled with tests and appointments, afternoons with medication and rest, nights with fevers and quiet conversations. I learned to recognize his pain by his expressions, to change damp sheets in the middle of the night, to persuade him to eat even a few spoonfuls of soup. The doctors spoke in terms of procedures, numbers, and stages, but to me, he was not a case study. He was proof that I could still do something meaningful. His family rotated in and out, but I was the one they called in emergencies. I was there when he vomited, when he became dizzy, when anxiety overwhelmed him. Eventually, I stopped going back and forth and moved into his apartment. First, I slept on the couch. Then on a small bed we placed in his room so I could respond quickly if he needed help. I organized his medications, scheduled appointments, and replied to messages from friends asking about his condition. Javier looked at me with gratitude, calling me his guardian angel and saying he didn't know how he would have managed without me. He spoke about the regret he felt over how our relationship had ended, about his immaturity and failure to take care of me properly. I didn't need apologies. It was enough to know that in the end, he had chosen to face the hardest part of his life with me by his side. He began saying he didn't want to leave me with nothing. Between hospital stays, he searched for insurance options, asked about my debts, and talked about making me a beneficiary or leaving me part of the apartment. His siblings clearly disliked this. I could see it in their expressions whenever my name came up alongside the word inheritance. But Javier was firm during his clearer moments. He said I had given up a stable life and a marriage to care for him, and that this was the least he could do. Deep down, I felt it was justified. In the middle of that routine of illness and exhaustion, I sometimes needed to breathe. One night, after his medication was adjusted and he fell asleep early, a friend messaged me. She said she was nearby and insisted I step out for a while, warning that I would lose my sanity if I didn't see something other than IV drips. I hesitated briefly, watched Javier sleeping, informed his mother I'd be gone for a short time, and left. We went to a bar with loud music, dim lights, and the smell of alcohol mixed with cheap perfume. I ordered a drink, then another, and for the first time in months, I felt like more than just a caretaker. At some point, a man approached me. He was confident, clearly aware of his charm. We talked about music, work, nothing of importance. When he asked if I was alone, I said, more or less. He told me to think only of myself for one night. One thing led to another. We ended up in an unfamiliar bed, driven by exhaustion and alcohol. I wasn't in love, and I barely remember his face, but in that moment, I felt entitled to a few hours without cancer, pain, or responsibility. When I returned to Javier's apartment at dawn, life resumed as if nothing had happened. I washed my face, prepared breakfast, and answered a call from the doctor. That night became something I chose not to examine too closely. I told myself no one had the right to judge me for needing a pause in the middle of that suffering. If the situation were reversed, I believed anyone would have done the same. I told Javier I had gone out with a friend to clear my head. He held my hand and said he hoped I remembered to take care of myself sometimes. Weeks later, I began noticing changes in my body: persistent tiredness, nausea, sensitivity to smells. I bought a pregnancy test almost automatically, more to dismiss the idea than confirm it. When I saw the 2 lines, my heart jolted. Sitting on the edge of the bathtub, I weighed the possibilities in silence. I could question my sanity or calculate dates, but what mattered most was what I needed to believe. I decided the baby was Javier's, not because I could prove it with numbers, but because that child completed the story as it needed to be completed. He was the child we never had when we were younger, the outcome of staying until the end, proof that something living had emerged from so much pain. I went to Javier's room with the test hidden in my pocket. He lay there pale, but awake as I told him I thought I was pregnant. His eyes filled with tears. With what little strength he had, he took my hand and spoke about hope, about this baby being a light in the darkness, about finding the strength to keep going. From that moment, everything revolved around that belief. I spoke to his family as though the pregnancy were unquestionable. His mother remained distant but did not openly challenge it. On his better days, Javier touched my still flat stomach and said he wanted to leave something for his son, that he wouldn't allow him to grow up without support. The doctors stayed neutral and professional. For them, the disease followed its course. Treatments were adjusted, but the prognosis didn't change because of my pregnancy. Javier died on a Thursday, just after 5 in the morning. the sound of machines, the smell of disinfectant, the pale light of dawn through the window. All of it merged into an image that still returns in my dreams. He struggled to breathe, gripping my hand, murmuring words I barely understood about taking care of me and the baby. His mother stood by the bed. A brother spoke with a doctor in the hallway. When the monitor's line flattened into a single sound, I knew he was gone, though my mind resisted accepting it. I spoke to his family as though the pregnancy were unquestionable. His mother remained distant but did not openly challenge it. On his better days, Javier touched my still flat stomach and said he wanted to leave something for his son, that he wouldn't allow him to grow up without support. The doctors stayed neutral and professional. For them, the disease followed its course. Treatments were adjusted, but the prognosis didn't change because of my pregnancy. Javier died on a Thursday, just after 5 in the morning. The sound of machines, the smell of disinfectant, the pale light of dawn through the window, all of it merged into an image that still returns in my dreams. He struggled to breathe, gripping my hand, murmuring words I barely understood about taking care of me and the baby. His mother stood by the bed. A brother spoke with a doctor in the hallway. When the monitor's line flattened into a single sound, I knew he was gone, though my mind resisted accepting it. I stayed there, holding his cold hand, until a nurse gently asked me to leave. On the hospital forms, I was listed as his cohabiting partner and primary caregiver. No one questioned it. At the wake, I sat closest to the coffin, received condolences, and listened to stories of his healthier years. His family embraced the idea of the unborn child, but never fully embraced me. To some, I was the former girlfriend who returned. To others, the woman who cared for him until the end. I nodded, my belly still small, convinced that time would clarify everything. After the burial, practical matters took over. His brothers discussed selling the apartment, settling debts, closing accounts. I remained there, surrounded by memories and belongings they no longer considered mine. Tensions rose. Comments were made about how we weren't married and how complicated everything was. Hints followed that it would be better if I moved out. As my pregnancy advanced, I felt my right to be there grow, even if no one else agreed. When my son was born, everything changed instantly. The first months were filled with sleepless nights, diapers, crying, and a heavy sadness that never fully lifted. Javier's family visited occasionally, brought gifts, took photos, but avoided serious discussions about responsibility. I managed alone. I sold furniture no one claimed, took temporary jobs, and eventually rented a small room in a cheaper area once it became clear they no longer wanted me in the apartment. Time was unforgiving. By the time my son turned 2, I was exhausted. I earned little, spent a lot, and constantly struggled to keep up. The room was cramped, buses roared outside, and the fridge was often nearly empty. I began thinking about my life with Rodrigo. It wasn't ideal, but it was stable. There was shelter, food, security. I convinced myself that a man as principled as he believed himself to be wouldn't leave a woman and a child with nothing. No matter how resentful he might be, I told myself it was time to reclaim what was mine. Rodrigo had always wanted children. In my mind, it was logical that after everything, he would take me back, even if only for the child's sake. I imagined arriving at the house, him opening the door, seeing us, breaking internally, and accepting that fate was forcing us to rebuild. I assured myself I had only followed my heart. One Monday morning at 9, I stood outside what had once been our home, holding my child and 2 small suitcases. I wore my best clothes, tidied my son, combed his hair, and rang the doorbell with a mix of anxiety and certainty. As I waited, I studied the familiar facade, the window of our old bedroom, the small garden I had helped plant. I felt as though I was closing a chapter. Rodrigo opened the door, looking surprised, not expecting anything significant. His eyes moved from my face to the child, from the suitcases to my worn shoes. I didn't see the emotional collapse I had imagined, only something distant and cold. I began speaking quickly, explaining that Javier had died, that I had cared for him until the end, that the child needed a real home, that this was still my house. I reminded him that I had always been committed, that what happened with my ex was an extraordinary circumstance. He stopped me calmly and said he needed a moment. He went inside, left the door slightly open, and returned with an envelope. He handed it to me without hesitation. Inside were copies of a divorce decree, dates, signatures, official stamps. The divorce had been granted 2 years earlier for unjustified abandonment. There were also documents showing the house had been sold. He told me he no longer lived there, that he had only stopped by to collect a few things, and that the new owners were moving in the next day. He finished by saying I was no longer his responsibility, that the child was not his, and that if I refused to leave, he would call the police. I tried to appeal to shared memories. I spoke about our dinners, the plans we once made, and how important he had been in my life. I gestured toward the child and reminded him that he had always wanted to be a father, that it didn't make sense for him to refuse to help me now. He looked at me with a mix of fatigue and resolve, and repeated that he owed me nothing. He said that when I left, I had made my decision, and that I couldn't return as if nothing had changed, carrying another man's child and expecting his life to have remained on hold. The door closed with a quiet click, but the sound stayed with me. I stood on the sidewalk with the morning sun on my face, the child beginning to cry, and the suitcases suddenly feeling heavier than they were. I looked at the front of the house one last time, knowing I no longer belonged there. What I felt was a combination of disbelief and a deep sense of injustice. After everything I had given up, after all I had cared for and endured, no one seemed willing to recognize my sacrifice. To everyone else, I was simply the woman who left her husband for a sick ex and returned with a child no one wanted. After that moment at the door, I understood that Rodrigo was no longer an option. Not because I couldn't insist, but because his response showed he had already decided to erase me from his life, reorganize everything without me, and present himself as the reasonable one. I sat for a while in a nearby park, my son in the stroller and the suitcases beside me, and took stock of what I had and what I lacked. I had no home. I had no husband. I had no steady job. The only thing I truly had was the full account of what I had done for Javier and the child who, for me, was the last connection to him. When I thought about it more objectively, I realized the only place where I could still claim anything was in the life I had built with my ex. I began introducing myself as Javier's widow. The word came easily, almost without thought. No one was checking for official paperwork. In the neighborhood where I now rented, people knew me as the woman who had left everything to care for a sick man and was now raising the son he left behind. When I ran into one of Javier's relatives at the store or on the street, and they referred to me as the woman who took care of him. I corrected them calmly, saying I was his partner and the mother of his child. I didn't argue or raise my voice. I simply stated what, to me, was true. One day, while going through an old folder I found in a cardboard box, I discovered something that grounded me. It was a draft of a will Javier had once started. It wasn't finished or legally signed, but in his handwriting, he mentioned his intention to leave me part of the apartment and a small insurance policy, so I wouldn't be left without support. It wasn't a final document, and it didn't solve everything, but it showed he had thought of me beyond his illness. Seeing my name there restored a sense of legitimacy I thought I had lost. With that draft, I went to see a local lawyer someone recommended. His office was on the second floor, with worn walls and little polish, but that didn't matter to me. I sat down and told him my entire story. I explained that I had left my husband to care for Javier, that I moved in with him, stayed until his last day, that I was pregnant when he died, and that the child was his son. I told him about the draft will, about Javier's promises to protect me, and about how his family had used the moment to remove me from the apartment and divide everything among themselves. The lawyer listened carefully, reviewed the papers, and asked a few direct questions. He didn't seem shocked, only methodical. He said the situation was complicated, but not impossible. Even without a marriage, he explained, it might be possible to prove cohabitation, financial dependence, and the existence of a child left without protection. He pointed to the draft will as an important sign of intent. He talked about timelines, legal actions, and the possibility of claiming part of the assets or some form of compensation. I left his office with a feeling I hadn't had in a long time, the sense that everything wasn't over. For the first time since Javier's death, someone acknowledged what I had always believed, that it wasn't right for his family to keep everything as if I had been nothing more than a temporary caregiver. I began to imagine what a favorable outcome could mean. Not luxury, but stability, a home of my own, fewer financial emergencies, a decent school for my son, and some recognition of the years I had given. When the lawyer told me he saw merit in the case and was willing to take it on, I felt that order was slowly returning. He explained that we would need evidence, photos, messages, medical records showing my presence, statements from neighbors and friends who knew I lived with Javier. He also stressed the importance of establishing that the child was his son to strengthen the claim. That didn't concern me. I had always spoken of my son as Javier's. I saw no reason to question it. I decided to move forward. I signed the documents, authorized him to represent me, and committed to gathering names, records, and anything else that could help. I didn't see it as a gamble, but as a basic demand for fairness. After leaving a stable marriage and life to accompany someone through the worst phase of his existence, expecting part of what he left behind seemed reasonable. I wasn't willing to be reduced to a vague memory or a footnote in the story of his illness. If recognition could only come through a judge, then that was the path. When the lawyer formally filed the inheritance claim, what had once been memories and papers became an official legal case. He asked me for contact details for Javier's family, addresses, phone numbers, anything needed to notify them. I provided everything without hesitation. I didn't feel I was harming them. I felt I was addressing something they had chosen to ignore. As I signed additional documents, he explained that once they were notified, they would have time to respond, that anger and conflict were likely, but that it was all part of the process. I agreed. Tension had existed since I entered Javier's life. So this was nothing new. Their reaction came quickly. The first call was from his mother, on a number I rarely used. I didn't answer. Then voice messages from one of his brothers followed, full of accusations. He said I was exploiting Javier's name, taking advantage of his memory, that Javier never intended to leave me anything, and that I should work instead of focusing on other people's money. I listened to the messages alone in the kitchen of the rented room, while my son played on the floor with an old toy car. I didn't respond right away. I knew anything said in anger could be used against me. When I did reply, I did so in the way that had always worked for me, calmly and with facts they preferred to overlook. I told them that no one had been with Javier as long as I had, that while they rotated visits, I was the one awake at 3 in the morning, changing sheets, cleaning vomit, and signing documents when they weren't there. Now I explained that I wasn't asking for anything that hadn't already been discussed while he was alive, only that Javier's expressed wishes be respected. They insisted the draft will had no legal value, that I was manipulating the situation and inventing rights. I repeated that no one could give me back the years I had spent there. Around that time, I changed how I use social media. Instead of posting casual photos of my son or generic quotes, I began writing about the cost of caring for someone until the end, and then being erased as if you had never mattered. I didn't mention names, but anyone familiar with the situation could understand. I shared old photos of Javier, blurred, partial, taken from angles that showed only a hand, a silhouette, a profile. I wrote lines like, "It's painful to see how blood relatives divide everything, while the person who was truly there is treated as an inconvenience." Some friends commented that I was strong, that God sees everything, and that justice may take time but eventually arrives. Others simply left a heart emoji and disappeared from the conversation. At least I felt I wasn't carrying the story completely alone. In the neighborhood, the version of events also settled in a way that suited me. When people asked why I was involved in a lawsuit, I said that Javier wanted to leave something for his son and that his family had opposed it out of pure spite. I didn't explain the legal details. No one asked. For most people, the situation was straightforward. A woman who cared for a sick man until the end, a small child, and a distant family that wanted to keep everything. No one at the corner store stopped to analyze dates or medical files. That kind of scrutiny is for people with time to spare. I simply repeated what mattered to me, that some sacrifices should not go unrecognized. Meanwhile, my lawyer continued preparing the case. He asked me for screenshots of messages where Javier thanked me, reports showing that I sometimes signed documents on his behalf, photos of us in the apartment, even grocery receipts that suggested we lived together. He spoke about witnesses, neighbors who could confirm they saw me there every day, and nurses who might remember that I was always present at his bedside. I did what I could, knocking on doors, searching my memory for names and faces, insisting that people agree to speak if needed. To me, this wasn't just a legal process. It felt like a formal challenge to the version Javier's family had promoted. They had always tried to portray me as someone who disrupted his life, who distracted him, who led him away from what they considered proper. Now, finally, there would be a place where someone with authority could hear that I was the one who held things together when they didn't know how to face so much pain. It wasn't only about money, though I needed it desperately. It was about restoring order to something that had been distorted from the start. I believed that if the judge ruled in my favor, everyone would have to admit that I hadn't thrown my life away on a whim, but for something that mattered. The day of the main hearing arrived sooner than I expected. The courthouse was old, with long hallways and a smell of dampness mixed with sweat. I woke up early to get my son ready, dressed him in the best clothes I had, and packed a small bag with toys, wipes, and food. I had no one to leave him with, so I brought him along. Part of me thought that seeing him there, small and clearly dependent, might influence those making the decision. My lawyer had told me to stay calm, speak only when asked, and avoid reacting to provocation. Walking into the courtroom felt like stepping onto a stage where my role had already been assigned. Javier's family sat together, composed and serious. His mother wore a plain scarf. His brothers looked unchanged, as if the situation barely affected them. Their lawyer carried a thick folder, carefully organized. Mine had far fewer papers, but he believed they were sufficient. I sat behind him with my son on my lap. The child played with a small plastic car, unaware of what was happening. The hearing began with formal procedures, names, identification, and a summary of the claim. My lawyer spoke first. He described my cohabitation with Javier, the years we shared before and after his diagnosis. He explained that I had left a stable life to care for a terminally ill man, that I had been his main support, and that a child had been born from that relationship without proper protection. He referenced the draft will, Javier's messages, and my documented presence in medical records. As I listened, I felt that someone was finally articulating what others had refused to confront. When it was my turn, I repeated the story I had told countless times. I explained how I left Rodrigo, moved into Javier's apartment, and accompanied him to every chemotherapy session. I said the pregnancy happened during that period, that we saw it as a sign of hope, and that Javier was happy about the idea of leaving something for his son. I avoided unnecessary details and focused on what supported the claim. Then the family's lawyer spoke. At first, his tone was measured. He said they respected my pain and acknowledged my role during Javier's final stage, but that this alone did not grant me inheritance rights. That part sounded expected. Then he introduced documents I had never seen, detailed medical reports, precise timelines, protocols I had never examined so closely while living through everything. One report came from the oncologist, another from a fertility specialist. They stated that due to chemotherapy and related complications, Javier had become sterile and unable to maintain full relations months before the estimated conception date of my son. The lawyer read this in a neutral, almost indifferent tone. He then added that, based on those reports, there was no biological possibility that Javier was the child's father. He concluded by saying my claim rested on false paternity. I felt heat rush to my face. I began replaying months in my head. Yes, Javier's body had weakened. Things had changed. Many nights he barely had strength to hold my hand, but I had never sat down with a calendar to calculate exact dates. To me, the child was his because it had to be. That belief gave meaning to everything. Hearing that belief dismissed publicly felt like the ground I had built under myself being pulled away. My lawyer tried to challenge the dates. He argued that bodies aren't precise machines, that reports can have margins of error, that doctors sometimes declare an end when small possibilities still exist. He suggested that even with sterility reports, exceptions can occur, and mentioned that genetic testing could clarify things. But the other side was prepared. They pointed out that no DNA test had ever been requested, that Javier had never formally declared paternity, and that everything relied on my statements. As they spoke, I felt the weight of the room, the judge, the assistants, even people waiting for other cases who stayed out of curiosity. I wanted to say that not everything fits neatly into reports, that intimacy isn't always documented, but I knew that speaking more would only give them material to twist. By the end of the hearing, I was no longer seen as a woman seeking recognition. In their eyes, I had become someone who lied about her child's paternity to secure financial support, someone who clung to a dead man's name for shelter. No one saw the sleepless nights, the hospital routines, a pain I had witnessed. They saw figures, documents, and a child who, according to their calculations, could not be Javier's. I left carrying my sleeping son, my chest tight, feeling that in a single session I had been turned into the villain of a story I had lived through with my own body. The verdict came months later, when I had learned to live under constant tension. I went to the courthouse on an empty stomach, more from nerves than lack of food. The judge read the decision in a flat, word dick, very disappointing, detached voice. He declared my inheritance claim inadmissible, stating that neither a formal union nor financial dependence had been proven. He said the child's paternity had not been established, and that medical reports raised serious doubts about my claims. He added that the process showed signs of bad faith on my part, accusing me of exaggerating and arranging facts to obtain financial gain. I was ordered to pay the family's legal costs. The amount wasn't large by public standards, but for me, it was overwhelming. The family's lawyer smiled slightly, not openly, but enough to show satisfaction. The outcome didn't stay confined to the courtroom. Within days, summaries of the case circulated. Screenshots moved from one group to another. People I hadn't spoken to in years knew I had lost an inheritance lawsuit, that a judge questioned my credibility, and that the child was likely not Javier's. With each retelling, the story became more distorted. Some said I had fabricated everything. Others claimed I narrowly avoided jail. In the neighborhood where I rented, attitudes shifted. The landlord began hinting that he didn't want problems, suggesting I might have to leave if attention or complaints arose. No reporters came, but whispers were enough. At the store, greetings became colder. Women who once chatted with me crossed the street. No one confronted me directly, but their looks said enough. Rodrigo found out too. One night, while washing borrowed dishes in the small sink, I received a message from an unknown number. It was brief and distant. He thanked me for confirming that leaving had been the right decision for him. He didn't mention the child or ask anything else. It felt like closure for him, a written confirmation of what he had always believed. I didn't respond. In his mind, I was proof of the warning he had given, that leaving with Javier was a dead end. With that label attached to my name, finding work became harder. Before, I could clean houses or care for the elderly and be seen as someone struggling but ordinary. Now, every form I filled out made me fear someone would search my name online. Jobs disappeared quietly. Offers were withdrawn without explanation. I ended up taking work no one wanted. Night shifts, cleaning offices, caring for elderly people who barely noticed me. Running errands for those who treated me as invisible. The pay barely covered rent, food, and my son's needs. The legal debt remained, growing beyond what I could manage. My lawyer expressed sympathy, but little else. I was tired of fighting systems that didn't move. The hardest part wasn't just financial. It was losing the right to tell my story without it being dismissed. Every explanation was filtered through a simplified version of me, the woman who left her husband, got pregnant, and tried to take money from a dead man. That version stuck, regardless of nuance. Time didn't fix things. It only changed their shape. Nearly 5 years have passed since Javier died. From the outside, my life looks like it's going in circles. My son is 4, active, curious, full of questions I can't always answer. Sometimes, he asks about his father when he hears others talk about theirs. I tell him his dad is in heaven, watching over him. It's easier to keep the story there than explain everything below. The truth is, I don't know who his biological father is. That night is a blur. Music, alcohol, fragments of memory. At the time, my focus was entirely on Javier and the hospital. After the trial, when paternity became a weapon, I tried to remember more, to search, to ask my friend discreetly. Nothing solid came up. Investigation was never an option financially. The jobs I keep are exhausting and poorly paid. I move between shifts and houses, often carrying a small bag of toys in case my son has to come with me. When I leave him with a neighbor, I feel both relief and guilt. He adapts to a fractured routine he never chose. Late at night, when the building quiets down, I sometimes search my name online. The trial summary still appears first, my name linked to abandonment, infidelity, and false claims. No matter what I post now, that version remains. I haven't spoken to Rodrigo again. I hear he rebuilt his life. I don't dwell on that. Sometimes, I think about how different things could have been for my son, but then I remember the door closing without hesitation. Everyone made choices and lives with them. Javier's family disappeared completely. No calls, no messages, not even birthdays. It's as if my son never existed for them. Some days, I think it's better that way. Other nights, when I have to choose between rent and medical care, I wonder how things might have been if they had helped even a little. There are nights when I replay everything like a poorly edited film. Javier's call, the argument, the suitcase, the hospital, the test, the doorbell, the verdict. I could say I was wrong about everything, that I should have stayed where I was, but that wouldn't be honest. At each moment, I acted based on what I felt and what I faced. What hurts most isn't the decisions themselves, but how everything is reduced to labels. To many, I'm the woman who made all the wrong choices. No one sees the exhaustion, the hours, the sacrifices that don't appear in records. My son carries that noise with him. I keep going because there's no alternative. I work, I care for him, I teach him small things. If anything good came from all this, it's him. He isn't responsible for the circumstances or the stories. And even if the world reduces me to a label, I know what I gave along the way, even if it was never written down.